In this lesson, we're going to talk about the anatomy of the domain layer, also known as the business logic layer. We've already described its concerns and responsibilities at a high level in the previous lesson. We want to dive into it a little bit deeper here. Your first question might be, why do some people call it the business logic layer and some people call it domain layer? Well, truth be told, I've seen a bunch of other names as well, depending on the author or the speaker. Unfortunately, that's just the way that it goes in information technology. There's lots of different names for the same sorts of things. I've seen it called the business rules layer, the domain logic layer, or the business layer, like we're going to see in a second here from the Microsoft Application Architecture Guide. They're all referring to the same thing. I'm going to try to use the term domain layer because I believe that's what this layer really does. It addresses a problem domain, or rather, the needs of the business. The rules that must be enforced, the workflows that must be automated. All that logic is concerned about the realm of the business, the domain of the business, and it should be separated into its own layer. But yeah, if I slip and talk about the business logic layer, forgive me. I mean the same thing. Just be patient with me. But you'll see it called by a lot of different names, so just be aware that we're talking about that middle box where all the business logic is contained. All right, so let's talk about the anatomy of a domain layer. What goes in here? Now, mind you, what you choose to implement in this layer will differ radically from application to application, and definitely from organization to organization. As I referred to a moment ago here, the Microsoft Application Architecture Guide may be of some help to us here. I'm going to steal the diagram that they have on page number 84 and also point you to some of the text that they have on page 85 regarding the definitions. They really they put 4 different sub boxes, I guess you could say, inside of the business layer of their diagram. They talk about the application facade, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But they also talk about business components and further break those down into business entities and business workflow. And you can read their definition there. Personally, they use the term component a lot. I'm a little uncomfortable with that because I see component as a packaging term. Eventually, we want to talk about packaging, how you take classes of code, you compile them into assemblies, and then you deploy those. And assemblies usually have a one-to-one correspondence with Visual Studio projects inside of your solution. And the reason why you might want to implement a given class in one project or another may or may not correspond with its purpose. It could have something to do with the amount of change that you anticipate in the application and how often you plan on deploying this one component over and over and over again. But we'll talk about component guidelines as we move through this guide. I think in a more general sense, just look at the difference between business entities and workflow. Following their terminology. To summarize, we're talking about the classes that represent the entities or the concepts in our problem domain when we talk about business entities. We create classes in our domain layer that represent the various aspects of the business problem. Could be the order class, customer class, tax class, promotion class, payment class, product class, order details class, and so on. It may also represent conceptual ideas that don't really have real-world equivalents or tangible equivalents. We'll talk about these a little bit later, but these could be steps in a process. That would be where the workflow comes in. Or we could talk about factory classes that create new instances of objects based on certain criteria that we passed in following a certain guidelines, and so on. Again, that's a discussion for another day. But each method and class in the domain layer is ideally highly cohesive. They do one job and they do it well. And furthermore, each class is decoupled where it makes sense. So there might be multiple implementations of a task class or promotion class, and you should be able to they should be able to interact with the order class in such a way that we can mix and match each implementation based on certain criteria, such as the amount of the order or the shipping address, and so on. So if you need more specific examples than the ones you see in the book or the ones that I just mentioned, I'm sorry. The entities and the workflows are as different as the different ways that organizations conduct their business affairs. What makes sense in your industry may make no sense in my industry. As an architect or a developer on a project team, you get paid the big bucks to figure out what the heck all this means in your particular application. There's no cookie cutter recipes for application architecture, and the business logic layer, the domain layer, is where this truism is the most pronounced. Now, at a higher level in that diagram that you see on screen is what they call the application facade, which I kind of call a sublayer, I would actually separate it out into its own layer. It goes by other names too, like the application services layer or the orchestration layer. There are probably a dozen other names. I'm going to devote an entire lesson to the application facade. I'm going to refer to it from now on as the application services layer. I'll explain why we need it, how it orchestrates the functionality in our application between layers, and so on. All right, so in my opinion, the domain layer should be as pure as possible. By pure, I mean that you should avoid using any third-party frameworks inside of the classes of the domain layer. Also, you should avoid API-specific parts of the .NET framework. For example, I wouldn't use parts of the ASP.NET framework inside of the domain layer for features like authentication and authorization if I could avoid it. Because yeah, today I might be building a web application, but if I create that dependency between my domain layer and the ASP.NET API, I'm no longer technology agnostic. I'm very much an adherent to a specific technology. I've coupled that application, I've coupled the entire business to this specific presentation technology, ASP.NET, and I may not want that in the future. So to be very clear here, I would strive to use only C# classes, methods, properties, interfaces, enums, and the like. I would try to abstain from using anything I didn't write personally inside of this layer, since it has to do with my organization, and nobody can abstract the problems I'm solving for my organization into a generalized library or API. I might choose to interface with a third-party API by wrapping a layer of code around it so that I can change out the implementation to a competing third-party API at a later time, but I don't want to reference that third-party API in the core of my code, okay? So let me give you a quick example what I mean by that. If I wanted to use a third-party framework, for example, I love using Log4net for logging exceptions that happen in my application. I would want to hide it in some way, probably behind what I would call a pattern called the facade, or rather hide it behind a class with just a handful of methods. This would allow me to change the underlying framework. I don't have to always use Log4net in the future, but it would allow me to keep the interface, all the methods and properties. I can still access those from my domain layer. So this again would allow me to change the underlying framework that I'm utilizing on this application in this implementation to another framework or another vendor at some later date. Or I might take an additional step and just inject in the logging component at runtime. We'll talk about dependency injection a little bit later on. Okay. So now that I've discussed what goes inside of a domain layer, why did I start this whole discussion about the various layers with the domain layer? Why did I start here and not the presentation layer? Well, I hinted at the fact that I might even start my development efforts by focusing on the design and the development of the domain layer first, assuming the application has any degree of complexity and it wasn't just a simple CRUD style application. So let me explain my rationale here. Again, assuming we have an application that has even a little bit of complexity, in other words, business logic, policies, calculations, validations, workflow, any type of decision making, and so on. I believe that you should tackle the part of the application where the complexity is first. That should be your first priority before you decide on what database you're going to use, what user interface is going to look like, all that kind of stuff. Because ultimately the presentation layer is not all that complex. Sure, there's a lot of technical details depending on which presentation framework or API that you choose, but the success or the failure of the application within the organization rarely depends on the user interface. The data access layer, it's not all that complex. I mean, sure, there's a lot of technical details depending on which data access layer, framework, or API or technology that you choose. You obviously have to be careful with how you retrieve and submit data to the underlying data store. But the domain layer should be a model of the organization's processes. It may be the only place, other than in the minds of the stakeholders and the end users, or in a series of documents that frankly nobody reads. It should be the only place where the business rules, the policies, and the workflows are enabled in any tangible way. Getting the model of the business right is the single biggest success factor of the project. If the user interface is ugly or if the data access layer isn't fast, those are easy issues to fix, quite frankly. As long as the domain layer is right, the application has a chance of success. I often say this, and this shocks people, that after running my own business, the technology stuff's easy. The business problems are the hardest problems to fix, to address. You can always find somebody with some technology skills. And frankly, while we like to think of ourselves as important to the process, there's a lot of people like us out there. But people who can solve business problems, they're a little bit more rare. All right? So make yourself one of those people, and you're indispensable by your organization. Furthermore, in one regard, it's the part of the application, the domain layer, is the part of the application least likely to change due to technology changes. But it's also the part of the application that's most likely to change due to changes in business processes or business rules. It provides the most value to the business. Since the business logic layer sits in the middle, it's the unifying concept of the application that ties together data storage to data presentation. It's also the main organizational concept in the application, tying the technical jargon that the developers use to the business jargon that the rest of the business users use. Now, there are some side benefits to approaching the development of the application domain layer first. For example, we can also enable unit testing up front instead of as an afterthought. In fact, we could go a step further. We can allow the unit tests scoped at user stories or use cases to drive the development of the domain layer. We can write tests. We can get a feel for the usage of the methods that we need before writing the methods that satisfy the unit tests, before writing the actual domain layer code. We start with the tests. We say this is what we need it to do, and then we go off and we develop classes in the domain layer that satisfy those cases that we've come up with in our unit tests. So we'll mock up or we'll stub out the data to begin with, which should save us time as we try to figure out what kind of data access layer that we need, what kind of methods we need to satisfy the unit tests. But then once we have, we solidify the domain layer code and we have confidence in the domain layer that it satisfies the needs of the business, that it's supported by all these unit tests, then we can go back and we can build and inject in the real data access layer, the real persistence layer at runtime to actually store and retrieve data. So the essence of the domain-driven design idea that's pushed forward by Eric Evans. Someday you want to aspire to this book, this way of thinking, Domain-Driven Design by Eric Evans. The essence of domain-driven design is to build a model of the problem domain and let everything else hang off of that. You can use your object-oriented programming skills to build classes that represent tangible and intangible objects in the problem domain. You consider which class a given attribute or responsibility should be delegated to. You think about the interaction of the objects and you model them. Perhaps the model will mirror the real world. Perhaps there's an artificial real-world constraint you can avoid in your model and get the same results. You design the interactions between the objects in the domain model in such a way that you begin to see neighborhoods of classes that gravitate towards each other, that have an affinity towards each other. And you consider how cohesive each object is. Is it too codependent with another class? Does it have too close of a relationship? If so, is it possible that you modeled it incorrectly? So you refactor the code and you use unit tests as a means of gaining confidence in the changes you made and determine what broke by my refactoring. And you do all of this before you even start to worry about the presentation layer or the data access layer. This might seem radical. Obviously it's not the way most applications are built that we might be familiar with, at least as we're getting started with software development. But I assure you, this is how real applications with any complexity are being built today. It gives you a high degree of confidence in your code, and it allows you to address the complexity of the application up front, and it allows you to mitigate the effects of business change on the application going forward. All right. Having said all of that, and this is going to add a little uncertainty to the mix, you don't always have to introduce a domain layer into your application. In the previous video, and just now, I encourage you to think about the hidden complexity found in edge cases. The fact of the matter is that not every problem has a lot of complexity to it. And I'm not just talking about simple CRUD-style applications. There are certain technologies from Microsoft even that provide other ways to implement security and validation and even some small business rule implementations. I'm talking about specifically WCF Data Services and the Azure mobile services. They allow you to write small scripts of code that are executed automatically on CRUD-style operations, create, rate, update, delete, and you can use these to check the user's permission level or validate the data prior to allowing CRUD operations on the data. And so these are just lightweight ways of performing domain operations. They're just these are just a couple off the top of my head. I'm thinking that there might be more as well. This is typically easier and faster than implementing an entire domain layer into your application. And fortunately and unfortunately in the .NET world, there are a lot of options and a lot of ways to accomplish the exact same thing. Not all options are bad, not all options are good. It really just depends. Again, you weigh the consequences and you move forward. Keep concerns separated with layers. Be ready to defend your design decisions. Consider whether you have enough complexity to warrant an entire layer devoted to tackling that complexity. And if you do, achieve maximum deniability. That's just a nice way of saying CYA. Are you familiar with that term? Document everything and be ready to defend your design decisions. All right, so now that we've talked about the domain layer and what its purpose is, we're going to go back to the presentation layer and talk about its role in an application's architecture. All right, hope this was helpful. I'll see you there. Thank you.